Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on whether you're watching us live or you're watching the recording, and also depending on which time zone you're on. My name is Tito Morais. I run an internet safety project from Portugal since 2003, which is called Kids Safe on the Net. At least in English, it's the equivalent. In Portuguese, is MiudosSegurosNa.Net. And this is our 18th birthday for this project. It started in 2003. And to celebrate it, we're starting to doing weekly live streams. And we do them in Portuguese and in English because those are the languages that I more or less can speak. And also to cater to Portuguese audiences and to English speaking audiences. We started the show on the 2nd of March. Then we had the second session with a Brazilian colleague who was speaking about games and the role of families, and also talking about gaming during the pandemic. And today we're talking about a topic that is very much on the public agenda, and we'll go into detail about that. It's basically the global battle against child abuse and exploitation online. And for that purpose, we have a guest that I'll be introducing in a minute. Just saying hi to those that are already following us. Antonio João Silva is a regular. Rosa Nunes is also a regular. She's complaining about the sound. We'll see what we can do about that. Ana Paula Loureiro, who also a part of an educational project called Somos Solução, is also following this. Thanks and welcome, Ana Paula. My colleague Luís Fernandes, with whom I've written a book on cyberbullying, is also with us and also complaining about the sound. This is weird because I'm getting our guest's sound was perfect. Perhaps during the session this will improve, hopefully. And Ana Paula Loureiro is also saying that the sound is not very good. Well, we'll see what we can do about that. But as I was saying, I have a guest with us, and let me welcome John Carr. Hi, John. Let me open your mic. How are you? First of all, thank you very much for having accepted this invitation. As I was saying, we'll be discussing the challenges we face at regulatory, educational, parenting, and technological levels in the battle for child safety online. We'll discuss challenges faced by child protection agencies, NGOs, and activists by regulations currently being discussed in the European Union and elsewhere. And you are somebody that is an expert in the area of child safety online. That's the reason, and you're also very much aware of all the regulatory challenges that we have been facing. So, and that's the reason that I've invited you to join us. And perhaps the people that are following us don't know you. So I would start to ask you, who is John Carr?
A friend of Tito's. That's the most important thing. It's great to see you again, and it's great to be doing a webinar in my own time zone. One of the few things London and Lisbon have in common is time.
Absolutely.
So I'm very old. I'm very, very old, as you can see. So I've been around. I've been around on this in this space to do with children and digital technology for many, many years. Essentially, I started working in this area in 1995. Although before that, I was doing various things, network installation, network management, and I've always written about the work that I do. And in 19 a column about the internet for a big British political magazine on the liberal left of politics, which is where I'm from. And one of the readers obviously liked my style of writing and the things I had to say, and they rang me up, and they worked for a big children's organization. Now, bear in mind, this is 1995. Okay, they worked for a big children's organization, and they said, John, we think this internet thing is going to be important for children. And I said, that's a good point. I'd never really thought about that. And they said, well, we think it's going to be. And then the following year, there was the World Congress Against Commercial Sexual Exploitation, which took place in Stockholm. It was the first World Congress. And from that point, the interest on the part of children's organizations and children's advocacy groups really began to increase as they became aware of what this new technology was. So they needed people like me who had a background in the technology to help them understand how it was going to impact on children. So that's really how I got involved. Before that, by the way, I was a lawyer, an academic lawyer. My special field was human rights. So it all kind of fitted. Together. So 1990. Sorry.
That's interesting. Interesting.
Yeah,
I didn't know that you were a lawyer.
Yeah, originally I was an academic lawyer. I was never a professional. I didn't practice, but that was my academic background, and human rights law was my special field. And then in 1996, we established the British hotline, which is called the Internet Watch Foundation, which deals with child sex abuse material. And I was on its first board of directors. So that's when my interest in this field really began to deepen, and I became more and more engaged with it. And today I'm on the advisory board of InHope, which is the global association of internet hotlines. I think we have members in 47, 48 countries on every continent. And I'm also the technical advisor to ECPAT International. I've worked with ECPAT International off and on since the year 2000. They're a global NGO based in Bangkok, and I'm very glad to say they have a national chapter in Portugal. And I think my colleague from ECPAT Portugal is on the call, on this call tonight. Great. So that's me. I hope that's enough.
Oh yeah, for sure, and it's interesting. Actually, I'm speaking out from Rio Tinto. Rio Tinto is a small town in the surrounding areas of Porto, which is in the north part of Portugal.
I was on holiday there just before lockdown. Beautiful place.
Really? Yeah. You should have rang me.
I thought you lived in Lisbon.
No, and I would have given you the tour of the town and places to see next time. Then
next time.
But it's interesting because the organization that you were mentioning, ECPAT, the representation is in Porto or in the other side of the river, which is Vila Nova de Gaia. And you mentioned an interesting aspect, which is a child protection organization in 1995 felt that the internet was going to have an impact, so they sought help from someone who understood the internet. Do you see that happening at the same time in many countries? Because in Portugal that really did not happen.
Okay,
so child protection agencies took some time to wake up to the realities of the internet.
Yeah, because they all had very immediate and important things to do right there and then. And this internet thing was brand new. It was American. Nobody really understood it yet, so it was quite rare. But when I got the call from the children's group, I actually realized that my own children were just getting to the age where they were starting to use the internet themselves. So I thought, well, I better find out about this stuff anyway, so I can be a good dad. So, but historically, what happened was this. So in the first three countries in the world where this issue became live were Norway, Holland, and the United Kingdom. And it all happened in 1996. around the time of the First World Congress in Stockholm, and they each set up an internet hotline. The Americans didn't actually set up their hotline until 2 years later, in 1998, and it's what we now call NICMEC, the National Centre. But you're right, Tito, lots of children's groups in most countries were quite slow picking up on it, and hotlines were one of the first things that they all got into.
I think most people thought it was a fad that it would go away, and so they didn't give it much importance. I also find it interesting because I've discovered the internet more or less at the same time in 1995. I then went on to work on an internet service provider. My background is in communications. And that's how I got involved in internet safety, because the company, that internet service provider, had security services. And for the same reason, I also realized, well, my children are in an age, well, they might be exposed to some risks online. So we share also that in common. My youngest children are now 23, 29, and the oldest one is 40. So there's some sort of parallel. Our concerns with our own also brought up the concerns with others. What have you been doing in the last few years to make the internet safer for children? Because the internet was never thought or built taking children into consideration. It was for military purposes, for academic purposes, and then business was on top of it, and children were always,
If you read the books that have been written about the early days of the internet, it's quite clear that everybody who was involved in setting it up in the beginning, when crucial decisions were made, particularly about security and so on, they had no idea that 30 years later, children would have it in their school bags, or that children would be lying in their rooms at night underneath their duvet on their mobile phone browsing the internet. They had absolutely no idea. And I think we can all be certain, if they had known that that was the way things were going to pan out, they would have done things very, very differently. Tim Berners-Lee, the guy who invented the World Wide Web, I think this week is the 35th or 35th anniversary of the first web browsers and the development of the web, and he's been saying exactly the same thing, that it's really turned out very differently from what all of those early idealists had in mind. And there's a great TED Talk video with a guy called Danny Hillis, who comes on the stage, and he's carrying a little booklet in his hand, a tiny little booklet. And he says, as he talks to the audience, "Here in my hand, I have a list of every person in the world who had an email address in 1982, he said. And there are two other people called Danny in this booklet, and I knew both of them." And he said, when you see this booklet, actually, it's slightly misleading, because everybody's name is entered in this booklet twice. Once by their name and address and where they work, and once by their email address. And every single person in that booklet basically knew each other. They were all computer scientists or technologists who were working on this wonderful new technology, which we now call the internet. They had no idea that children were going to be part of the picture. Absolutely not.
And as I was saying, that was the beginning, and still today, for instance, in Portugal, Parliament will be discussing a law which is basically the Charter of Internet Rights for Internet Users, the Charter Rights for Internet Users, or something along those lines. And I spoke with the authors and said, well, there isn't a word about children. And children make up 1 in every 3 internet users. Oh, yes, you're right. We're thinking about this in general terms. Well, the thing is that children have very specific needs, and they need to be taken into account when we are drawing the Charter of Rights for Internet users. So even 30 years later, children are not being taken into account when there are, political decisions being made that have a huge impact on their future. But this is a side comment. As I was saying, what have you been doing in the last few years to make
just on that
the internet?
On that point, about I think it's 3 years ago now, it might have been 2.5, myself and Professor Sonia Livingston from the London School of Economics, where I'm also a fellow, and Yasmina Byrne, who works for UNICEF. She worked at that time at the Innocenti Research Center in Florence, in Italy, but she's now in New York. We brought together all of the data, and it had never been done before, which was rather surprising. But never before had anybody documented the real scale on which children and young people were actively engaged with the internet. We all kind of knew they were, obviously, but nobody had sat down and actually dug out the official numbers and done the mathematics to prove exactly the point you were making, Tito. 1 in 3 of every internet user in the world is a child. In some parts of the world, it's more than 1 in 2. And yet, when you go to meetings, when you listen to government people speaking and politicians speaking, I'm afraid in a great many countries, it's exactly the same as it appears to be in Portugal. They never think about children. And so you ask, what have I been doing in the last few years? I've been doing this. I've been trying to make sure that children's voices are heard and that the rights of children are central to every decision that are being made. Imagine 1 in 3 of every user is a child. How can the technology be rolled out? How can it be deployed if the people producing the technology or providing the services don't have in mind that 33.33%, more than 50% in some parts of the world, are in fact children who cannot cope with, deal with things in the same way that adults can. So that's what I've been doing a lot. I've been working a lot with the Council of Europe, because they've been very energetic and very active in this area, and they've developed a wonderful handbook to help governments understand in a very detailed way the kind of things that they can and should be doing. I've done a lot of work with the International Telecommunications Union in Geneva, and with bodies like the Internet Governance Forum. But you know, one of the conclusions that I've reached, and it's not original, and it's not unique to me by any means, is that in the early days, we believed that self-regulation of the internet was the answer. We trusted big tech. I was guilty of it. I shared the dream. You know, I bought into this whole utopian hippie idea of this new technology coming out of California. It was going to change the world. Tyranny would be ended. Poverty would be finished. Nobody would ever die of hunger again, because now we had the internet. And look how it's turned out. Look what happened in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of January. Look what's happening with Holocaust denial, with fascist groups reaching out to children. Nobody imagined that these things were possible, and self-regulation allowed it to happen. So I'm now completely convinced, I'm afraid, that we need to move to a much more interventionist regulatory framework for dealing with the management of the internet going forward. And that, if you like, is now my central mission.
Okay. I guess we all learned that self-regulation doesn't work. There also needs to be some regulation. We've learned about it in other sectors, such as the financial sectors.
Yeah.
Because, you know, there are organizations that they have their own interests in mind, and not their customers or their users or whatever. But now we are facing in Europe with a situation that could have been avoided regulatory-wise, aren't we, John? I mean, we have the EPrivacy Directive. Then there's a law that directive that comes into play, and that basically prevents tech companies from continuing to do the job that they were doing in terms of deploying technologies to detect and to remove child sexual abuse and exploitation material. So what do you think about what is happening on the temporary derogation? And how do you think this whole situation that we got ourselves into will end up?
Yeah,
or how it was possible in the first place to
it's a complete and total disgrace. And bear in mind, everybody looks to the European Union for leadership across the world. So this is not just a local matter for us as Europeans. This is an issue with global significance and global importance. So just in case some of your viewers or listeners are not familiar with it. And this started off with self-regulation. This started off in the time when everybody believed self-regulation was the best way of doing things. And it did achieve some good things. So many companies, starting in 2009, many companies started to do 3 specific things, and they did them on a voluntary basis. One was, as you just said, Tito, they were able to identify images of children being sexually abused, still pictures or videos that had been published on the internet. They were classified as being illegal by the proper authorities. They were then able to make a digital fingerprint, it's called a hash, of those images, and then use technology to find copies of those images on their own platforms, and then obviously delete them and remove them. So that's been going on a voluntary basis since 2009. The second thing that started more recently is that they, and Google in particular deserves some credit for this, I have to say, they developed tools which would allow them or allow tech platforms to identify images that were probably child sex abuse material, but hadn't yet been actually officially identified by the proper authorities and classified as being illegal. And the reason for that was simply because the volumes are so large. It's not that they're likely to be any doubt, there were just such gigantic numbers. Now, I'll come on to the numbers in a minute. So those tools are called classifiers. The third thing, which Facebook in particular was very energetic in doing, again on a voluntary basis, they developed tools which allowed them to identify activities on their platforms. And here in particular, we're talking about Facebook Messenger and Instagram Direct, but also on the main website as well, or the main Facebook platform itself. They were able to identify patterns of behavior which suggested that somebody was approaching a child to proposition them in an illegal sexual way. The grooming, anti-grooming tools. Now, what happened was that on the 21st of December last year, a section of the EPrivacy Directive came into effect, which made each of those 3 tools illegal. And Facebook stopped using them immediately. Other companies, Microsoft, Google, LinkedIn, Roblox, Yubo, and
Snapchat more recently.
Yeah, that's it. The other one, they decided to ignore the law, or rather they decided that there was sufficient ambiguity about the law to allow them to carry on. So I think it was shocking that Facebook simply said, we're not going to do it anymore. Facebook goes to court at the drop of a hat if it thinks that its economic interests are being threatened by a government decision or a government announcement. In this instance, they simply said, we're not going to fight it. We're just going to stop protecting children in the way that we have been doing. So that's the problem that we're in. And it was all created by this oversight, this negligence. I don't know how you explain what happened, that the Parliament and the European institutions allowed to happen with the EPrivacy Directive. So the Commission have published a proposal which, if it was passed by the Parliament, and there's a lot of fighting going on over that, if it were passed on the Parliament, what it would do is it would say, okay, we messed that up. What we're going to do is we're going to temporarily suspend the operation of those rules so that companies can resume, and Facebook in particular can resume doing the kind of child protection activity that they were doing before. But unfortunately, it's run into substantial opposition within the European Parliament. But just before we move on to discuss that, let me just give you, again, because I'm not absolutely sure who is on the call, so they might not have a very clear idea about the scale of the problem that we're talking
the
about.
numbers.
Okay.
And that was also what I was going to ask you, John, is the size of Facebook reports in relation to the other companies that we were talking.
Because you'll see, I'll give you that. So in the year 2020, so that's the last year for which numbers are available, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in America received 21.7 million reports of illegal content that had been found on their platform. 93% of all of that 21.7 million came from Facebook Messenger or Instagram Direct. And by the way, that's slightly down on the previous year. The previous year it was 94%. And 31,654,000 of these reports, because there were 21.7 million reports, but each report could have more than one item in it. Okay,
right.
So within the total volume of reports, there was 31,650,000 video files of children being sexually abused, and there were 33,700,000 images, still pictures, still photographs of children being sexually abused. And there were 120,000, over 120,000 other reports which related to grooming activity or similar kinds of things. So you can see these tools that have been used up to last year at any rate have been very, very good at picking up the substantial volumes of child sex abuse material and other threats to children which exist. Now, one of the criticisms, by the way, that our enemies have had, and I'm going to call them enemies just the shorthand, okay? I'm not sure, I don't think they're evil people, but they're not, we have a different perspective on this. One of the points that they make is, well, surely this policy has failed. If you're finding 21.7 million reports in a single year with 31 million videos and 33 million still pictures, doesn't that show you that the policy is useless and that it's just not working because every year these numbers are going up? The answer to that is no, it does not show that. What it shows is that the tools are getting better at detecting the illegal material. We've never known, nobody ever knows how much crime is taking place in the world because the criminals don't fill in annual reports and send it to the judge or the police. So of course we know we're better now at knowing the real scale, but that simply tells you why the tools are important. It doesn't tell you why we have to stop using them.
Mm-hmm. And it will also tell us most probably that those numbers don't reflect the reality because those are the companies that use those tools. And
correct.
There are many others that don't. And then there's also the underground web, the dark web, that where most probably those technologies are not also used, and that these type of images circulate almost freely. The other thing is,
you make a very good point there, Tito. Just to underline the importance of that point, if you look at the published numbers that I mentioned earlier, you will see hardly any reports coming from any Apple related device or Apple company. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Because all of the activity on Apple devices at the moment is encrypted, so the company cannot see the nature of the activity that is taking place using their devices and using their services. But if Facebook is having that number of illegal images being exchanged on its platform, 93% of 21.7 million, it's absolutely, definitely going to be the case that a similar scale of offending is taking place with Apple-related platforms and devices and services, but they don't know about them, which means we don't know about them because they can't see them.
Absolutely. So the fact that Facebook stopped using these tools means that those numbers will only increase, but they will go undetected.
Correct, and we now know because it's now what 9 weeks, 10 weeks since the 21st of December,
right?
And NECMEC did a calculation of what drop there had been in reports being received by NECMEC since the 21st of December, and I think it's a 51% drop. Okay. In the number of reports being received by NECMEC coming out of European Union member states. Now, so a 51% drop in what would have been the case if things had carried on the same basis as before. But if you bear in mind that the total numbers are increasing, actually the real impact is greater than 51%. But of course, we don't know how much greater.
Okay. Let me just say that the sound issues that people were complaining at the beginning were solved almost from the get-go. So people are telling us that they are listening well since the beginning. Also have Duarte Araújo, who's head of children's PTA, a PTA here in the north of Portugal. He's also saying good evening. So good evening, Duarte, and welcome. Let me also remind people that they can feel free to leave us their questions or comments in whether they are watching on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or LinkedIn, and I'll put them on screen, and I'll have ask John to answer them. The other thing is, what sort of
by the way, that is very impressive, Tito. I've never done one of these before, which is simultaneously on 3 different platforms. That's very good. You're obviously a very gifted technologist.
Thank you. I'm not the one doing the miracles. The technologists are. I just use them, and sometimes badly, because I can't figure out. I was having trouble connecting my microphone and yours. So the other question is, what sort of threat does strong encryption pose on mass messaging platforms? I have to tell you that I have my doubts regarding encryption. I don't have a definite position on that. That has to do with family history. As you know, Portugal lived under a dictatorship. Part of my family had to escape Portugal and lived in exile. And it was very common that letters that my father sent to my mother or to my elder brothers were read before we received them. So I look at encryption as a way of protecting that type of messaging. Those days it were letters. Nowadays it's messages, emails, and things like that. So that's on one hand. I see encryption as a tool that can help protect people, that can be somehow prevents, for instance, mass surveillance, which is something that I find creepy. On the other hand, I mean, I've worked the past 20 years of my life defending children's rights. And I also see that encryption can pose a risk to children. And I'm wondering, is there a way we can balance these two interests?
The first time, you just reminded me, Tito, the first time I visited Portugal was when the MFA, the Movimento Forças Armadas, was the
Exactly.
had just taken over from the fascist dictatorship. It was a very exciting time to spend a summer holiday in Lisbon, which I did that year.
Mhm.
I didn't understand the politics at all, but it was very exciting to be there. So strong encryption, just to remind ourselves, what that means effectively is that nobody has got the means to see what is happening within the encrypted environment. Now, there are some places where strong encryption or the use of strong encryption is essential. Banking. I want my banking, which I do online, to use the strongest possible encryption. We want our nuclear power stations and our national electricity grid and all kinds of things to use the strongest possible security, which often will mean encrypting messages which are exchanged between different components of the infrastructure. The problem that we've got, however, now is that strong encryption is being used in mass messaging platforms where nobody knows who anybody is. And what we do know is because occasionally the police are able to get into these criminal networks using other means. Usually it's an accident, by the way. You know, they might arrest a guy in a park and he's forgotten that he's got a bit of paper on him with a password or a code in it. So it's not high-tech sleuthing that they're doing, it's stuff like that. So they get into these criminal networks and they see that they're using strong encryption in a way which means the police can never, ever get hold of the evidence. So in effect, what strong encryption is doing is threatening the rule of law. I told you earlier I was an academic lawyer. So one of the key ideas in the rule of law is that the law can be enforced. If you have a law that can't be enforced, it's not only worthless, it brings the whole idea of the law into disrepute. And so now we've got things happening on the internet where, and in America, it is very well documented. The FBI and the courts are going with warrants. So there's been a decision taken by a court, by a judge, asking for evidence to be produced, and the company cannot produce it because they can't access it. And the most famous case, if you remember, was those two terrorists in California on the Apple phone, and that seems to me to be wrong. So we need to try and. But I'm not in favour of spies of any country, Chinese, Russian, Portuguese, British, American, looking at my private messages. Of course not. But we've got to find some way of allowing these encrypted environments to continue being used in ways which don't threaten the very idea of the rule of law. And I don't know what the answer is. There are forms of strong encryption which do exist that would allow you to continue to detect specific things within the encrypted environment, like an illegal child sex abuse image. But the problem is they don't work at scale. And unless it works at scale, it's useless.
We were talking just before going into the air that I saw a webinar with Ami Farid, who was the inventor of PhotoDNA, and one of those webinars he was saying that they are working on a technology that can be used to detect child abuse material within encrypted communications without violating the privacy of those communications or of the users, let us say. So I'm curious to see what will come out from there. It looked like it was something that was in the works but not finalized.
So the way PhotoDNA and these technologies work is that they look for signals of patterns of known criminal activity or behavior. And a hash is simply a pattern. And the way I try to explain how it works is like this. When we used to go to airports, yeah, we'd be walking through the airport hall with our suitcases, and dogs would come up and sniff our suitcases. Right. These dogs have been trained to smell marijuana or cocaine or dynamite or whatever, and or we'd put our bags through the X-ray machines, yeah, and they were looking for guns and bombs and things. If the dogs didn't smell any cocaine or marijuana, if the X-ray machines didn't see anything that looked like it might be a bomb or a gun, nothing happened. We just carried through. Did the dogs understand what kind of privacy? Underwear? Yeah. Did they invade my privacy? No, they didn't. And I think that's the way we need to think about this. I don't want anybody looking at my private messages, but I don't have a problem with companies or the police or whoever it might be making sure that the illegal behavior isn't happening.
Mm-hmm. An interesting question is being asked by Abilio. Abilio is also a regular on our show, so thank you for being with us, Abilio, and for your question. And he asks, do digital platforms that use artificial intelligence to control images of abuse have specific legislation for protection, or does not yet have legislation globally?
It doesn't exist. This is part of the problem that we've got in Europe, that there isn't a proper legal basis for doing it. So we do need it. Obviously, we need clear laws that we all know about and we can all understand. It hasn't existed, but that's a product of the history of the way the internet developed, and it's a product of this early idea about self-regulation. So the answer to the question is, it doesn't. That legislation on how to use AI does not yet exist, but we're going to have to create it.
Okay. Mm-hmm. An interesting observation also on the webinars that I saw with Anne Farid, the inventor of photo DNA, is that he was very adamant at stating that the technology, either photo DNA or the anti-grooming technology, does not use artificial intelligence, is hash-based technology, you know. So, and I believe that he was clear to say that, because that might have something to do with those technologies being used for those purposes might be privacy invading. With this in mind, what importance do you attach to the question of transparency on using these technologies and other technologies that promote child protection and online?
In some ways, if you were to ask me what do I think is the single most important thing that we need to achieve in this current round of policy reviews and changes in the law, it's transparency. Because we now know very clearly and very well that if we've no reason to trust or believe big tech when they say anything, yeah. How many times has Facebook and Google been taken to court and been found to be doing things that they weren't supposed to be doing? More times than I can remember. But if we'd had a proper transparency regime, if we'd had a body with the legal powers and the technical knowledge and the ability to inspect what the companies were doing, in the same way that we have bodies that inspect what the banks are doing, and they inspect what the insurance industry is doing, and the medical and the drugs industry and so on is doing, then we would be in a different position, because these companies would know that people were watching and understanding what they were doing at a detailed level. And so I think transparency is absolutely fundamental to the way forward, because whatever new technologies develop or whatever any new laws develop, we're still going to need to be reassured that they're actually making a difference or they're being properly applied.
Mhm. So, can I infer from your words that you favor the existence of a regulatory body for tech companies, as we have, for instance, for banks, for
Correct.
consumer, for data protection?
Absolutely, 100%. The internet is too important. It's too integrated and intimately involved in the way we live our modern lives to be left simply to profit driven or private entities to make important decisions. I mean, think about the free speech stuff and what happened in America on the 6th of January. Facebook and it shouldn't be in the position where it's making decisions about how our democracy is run, but that's the reality of it. So we do need, but how you construct it, that's a whole other question. It needs to be a body that people like you and me have trust and confidence in. If people think it's a political instrument used by a government, it's no good. And I don't know yet what the proper formula will be, how we will get to that.
Yeah, because we have the same problems with governments, right? We can't put ourselves either in the hands of government because they will be politically influenced, and the same thing with companies because they will be driven by profits, basically.
Yeah,
So it needs to be something that is independent from
correct.
governments and from
Yeah.
companies. Okay, interesting, very interesting.
Many, many,
The other
many,
question,
many, many, many years ago, we might have said, "Let the Vatican do it." Not anymore. Not today. Not today. But many, many years ago.
okay. Another question that's been discussed lately is the creation of an European equivalent of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Um, is there going to be a new European center to help in the fight to tackle child sex abuse? Will it be useful, or will it be two organizations doing the same thing? Or do you feel that Europe cannot be dependent on the US for such an important
Yeah.
task?
Yeah. I should be clear. I am working on exactly this project as a consultant right now.
Mhm.
First of all, the European Union has said it is developing a new strategy to combat child sex abuse in Europe, and that will apply online and offline. And and of course, it has to do that because the internet and children's real lives in the physical world are now completely intertwined. You can't separate them anymore. So it will address both online and offline threats to children's health and well-being from the point of view of child sex abuse, activity, material, and so on. And one of the questions that arises is the question of how do we deal with illegal images? We know what the scale is because I gave you those numbers before from NECMEC. But here is the simple truth. Every European police force is pretty much dependent on one institution in the United States for the great majority of the intelligence that it gets against crimes against children in Europe. That is not a good position to be in. The analogy I use is GPS and satellite navigation systems. Historically, the whole world used the American system, the GPS system, and the European Union decided that is not strategically very sensible or sustainable in the long run. So they developed the Galileo system, which is a European satellite navigation system. So even if we fall out with the Americans, they could elect another madman, another Trump Jr. or something. Um, Even if we fall out with the Americans, the whole of Europe won't grind to a halt because we have our own satellites in the sky that help with navigation system. The Russians have got their own satellites now. The Chinese have got them. I think it's pretty much the same when it comes to questions of child protection. Europe should be able to protect children itself without having to rely on another country to do it. Now, does that mean we need to completely copy and replace the American center? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that we have our own institutions that work with the Americans. Absolutely. And there's plenty of work. There's no competition here. It's not as if we do it in Europe, there will be less to do in America. It doesn't work like that. So I am very strongly in favor of having arrangements in Europe that work for Europeans. And by the way, I include the British in that. But obviously for the European Union member states, it's incredibly important that they can look after children themselves if they have to.
Okay. I understand the point, and I agree that it might be in a way a duplication of efforts, but it all depends on how well both organizations and how well both organizations will cooperate.
Correct.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Another thing, John, the United Nations has approved General Comment 25, stating that basically children's rights apply equally offline and on the digital environment. I know that you have written a document for the Council of Europe on the subject. What are the consequences of that decision for children?
Well, in most European countries, there are very good laws and legal frameworks which help protect children's rights, but not in every one of them. There are still 2 countries in Europe where it's not illegal to possess child pornography, child sex abuse material, for example. So it's not as if Europe is a shining example to the rest of the world. So what the UN document, the General Comment, is meant to do is update the original UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was adopted in 1989. So it is in effect a pre-internet document. And there's no doubt, if they'd been writing the UN Convention today, they would use different language, because it just didn't anticipate. Nobody could have anticipated the big change that the internet was going to bring. So the General Comment, which has now been adopted but hasn't yet been published, or at least the official version hasn't yet been published. We've all seen a version of it, but nobody, well, very, very few people have seen the actual final one. I think it's coming out in a couple of weeks' time. It's really about updating that convention for the digital age, and it makes the point that you made earlier, Tito, and that we've discussed, which is that children are major players in the digital space, and companies and governments have to stop forgetting that they exist. When they think about new laws, children should be front and center of their minds. How will this law impact on children should be a question that they ask every time they sit down and think about a new law or a new policy. That has not been happening in a great many countries up to now. So the hope is that with this new General Comment that will be promoted, and with the Council of Europe's handbook as well, which is in many ways extends and builds upon, it's very similar in spirit to the General Comment, governments around the world will have a blueprint really for how to approach these things going forward.
Interesting. Amelia has another question. We're reaching our time limit, but we still have time for this. Billy asks, in this pandemic, children are online even to study. Cases of greater exposure and less privacy have increased. How has this greater exposure been going on in other countries?
So there are 2 things to say about this incredibly important question. One is, even in Britain, we were shocked, genuinely shocked, to discover that 30% of children in British schools didn't have the means when they were at home to get on the internet to do their homework. You cannot do chemistry homework on a mobile phone, right? You need a proper screen, you need proper bandwidth. Yeah, if your parent, you know, so we need to do a lot more to close this digital divide. And by the way, this won't be a surprise, in 99% of the households of children of rich parents, they had it. Yeah. All of the children that didn't have it were from poor households. So this is a class issue. It's a major question of social policy that we must correct urgently. The second thing, going back to the specific point in your question, a lot of very bad things have been happening to children during lockdown. The British police have reported a 30% increase in the arrests that they've been making for grooming and for publishing child sex abuse material. All of the mental health charity lines and all of the health services for children's mental health have been reporting a huge increase in cases of eating disorder, depression, things of this kind that have arisen from children being locked up for so long and being put on the screen. So definitely bad things happening to children online. We've had examples. There was a great case that the Canadians exposed of organized groups of pedophiles exchanging information with each other, basically saying, "Hey guys, all of these kids," and they were interested only in young boys. This particular group, all these young boys are going to be on their screens. This is a great time to make friends with them. This is a great time to get them to do stuff and make pictures and things of that kind. So these guys were there energetically, actively trying to get hold of children to abuse sexually, knowing perfectly well that they were going to be indoors on their machines much more than usual. And then, of course, there is the ordinary physical health and safety. Kids need to be outside. They need to be playing football. They need to be going swimming. They need to be doing all of these things. So all of these things together mean that today's kids have had a really rough time of lockdown.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, in line with this question, that somehow, because of what you were saying, that 30% of children didn't have devices to access the internet at home, that the right to education has been in jeopardy?
Correct. And I think we will see, it's not in this general comment, but it's very near. I think eventually we will see the right to internet access to complete a child's education is a human right of every child, and every government in the world has an obligation to make sure that every child has got the means to do their homework properly, to stay in touch with their friends and all of those kinds of things. Because if you're the only kid in the school who hasn't got the internet, and you're not on the social media, you're not part of the same crowd as everybody else, you're the weird kid or you're the poor kid. Yeah, that's wrong. So it's got to be seen, recognized as a fundamental right for every child.
Yeah, and I saw, I believe you made a post with declarations from Tim Berners-Lee that it is a human right to have
Correct.
access to the internet, and I also believe that we'll be going in that direction. The Portuguese government is working on a proposal to have a social internet service, so that in order at reduced rates and things like that.
Very good.
But do you think that it will be on reduced rates, or do you think that children will have the right to have access to the internet for free?
They should have it for free, is my opinion. It's a human right. It's like the health service. You shouldn't have to pay for it. At least that's the British philosophy. And that's what and when you look at some things happening in the developing world where Facebook and Google have been providing free access to the internet, but it's free in inverted commas because they're commercially gaining from it, and they're basically making children think that the internet means Facebook. That's wrong. That's wrong. It shouldn't be tied to individual commercial interests in that way.
Okay, John, we're within the hour, so one last question is if you can give us an insight. And our audience is usually comprised of parents, educators, and professionals that work with children. But I would include an additional audience that I'll work in order to have access to this recording which is politicians. So can you give us four insights, one for parents, one for educators, one for professionals, and one for politicians, regarding child safety online and prevention of
Well, I'll start with the
child sexual
politicians.
abuse online?
Yeah, I'll start with
Okay.
the politicians because they're the people I deal with probably most frequently, and that is that this is a hugely important defining question of public policy in the 21st century. That self-regulation has failed. I want public policy in my country to be decided by the people I elect. I do not elect Facebook. I don't elect Google. I don't elect Microsoft. I elect you. And your job is to make Britain a better place, or Portugal a better place for me and my children. And that these days means dealing with the internet. Don't be frightened of these big companies. They need your money more than you need theirs. So that was what I would say to the politicians. To the parents, I would say, don't be frightened of the technology. You might think your kids may have seemed to know a lot more about individual devices or games or things, but knowledge is not the same as wisdom. What you've got is wisdom about the way the world works. And being a parent in the internet age, it's just another bit of being a parent. We've always had a hard time of it. This is just an extra layer of it, but it can be done. And there's lots of great resources out there. Tito can tell you all about the resources that are available to help parents have these conversations with their children, and never threaten to take away the technology from your children if you think that they've been doing something they shouldn't have, because what that means is they'll just try harder to keep it a secret the next time. Teachers, well, I think all teachers have learned a lot from lockdown. And one of the things, certainly, that the teachers I know here in England have learned is that they need to understand the technology better themselves so they can use it in a creative and exciting way to help the children engage better with the learning at school.
And for professionals that work, for instance, with children,
yeah, well, I think professionals.
Care.
Yeah, I mean, this may sound a little bit harsh, and I don't mean it to sound harsh or unkind. If you work with children and you don't understand how children use the technology, you're not doing your job properly. It's like being a parent in a way, another bit of being a parent. This is the reality of children's lives in the 21st century. So don't be scared of it. Embrace it. Understand it as well as you can. You don't have to know everything about every device or app, because you know the kind of things that can happen to kids, and they're happening online in more or less the same way as they do offline, with obvious adjustments being made. So it's part of, I think in future, every social worker qualification, every teacher qualification is going to have a major bit in it, which is about the technology and its impact on children.
John, I have one last question. I'm sorry, it just came in. Carlos Menezes is asking, good evening. Regardless of the regulatory issue, what do you think about the extreme use of digital devices by increasingly younger children? Toddlers,
Okay.
let us say.
I got that. My granddaughter is 7 years old, and she's away with her tablet if we give her half a chance. Well, first of all, factually, nobody yet has got any definite evidence about what the right amount of time is, or what the right age at which a child should be using these devices. I think we can only use our common sense for now. And certainly, I think it is absolutely, it's almost certainly the case that we shouldn't let children use screens at all before the age of 2 or maybe 3, something along those lines. And and it's what's important is what the children are doing when they're on the devices or when they're on the internet. You know, one parent once said to me, "Oh, my child he reads all the time. I've got absolutely no worries about him." I said, "Do you know what he's reading? I mean, what if he's reading Mein Kampf? You know, you need to. It's not just about." You see what I mean? It's about what they're doing rather than simply being on the screen.
Okay, John, Thank you very, very much for your time. It was a great conversation. The hour went by very quickly. It was a pleasure to hear you. Let us hope that the European Union sorts out the e-privacy derogation as soon as possible, sooner than later, hopefully. And let's hope that the Portuguese presidency is able to persuade the European Parliament, that seems to be the entity that is more against problematic in reaching an agreement. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure having you, and I hope that, and I'm sure our viewers also enjoyed it very much.
Thanks a lot.
Let's keep in touch, and remember, if you come to Porto next time, let me know, because I can play the tour guide for free.
I will definitely do that. And we're definitely coming back.
Okay.
Cheers, then. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.